The last of the autumn light came through the library windows at Hartwell Park in long amber bands, and it fell across the hands of the woman who sat beside the old Earl's chair, her voice low and steady over the verse she had been reading for the better part of an hour. Cecily Lennox held the book open with both hands, her fingers careful along the spine where the leather had cracked and softened with decades of use. The Earl of Hartwell, 78 years old and thin as paper, had closed his eyes 3 stanzas back, and his breathing had taken the slow, deep rhythm of a man who was not sleeping so much as resting inside the sound of another person's care. She did not stop reading. She never stopped when he drifted. The words were not for his attention. They were for his company. And in the doorway behind her, half in the corridor's shadow, Lord Julian Ashworth stood with one shoulder against the frame and his arms crossed over his chest, listening. He had been there for 9 minutes. Cecily did not know this. She knew only the weight of the book, the angle of the light, and the faint scent of coal smoke from the grate where the fire had burned low, and no one had thought to build it back. If you have ever sat with someone whose presence made the room feel less empty, you already understand what Julian heard when she read. Stay close. Lady Philippa Ashworth had a way of entering a room that made the room feel corrected. She was the Earl's daughter-in-law, Julian's mother, and for the 14 months since Cecily's arrival, she had maintained a precise and unwavering position on the subject of the woman who read to her father-in-law every afternoon. She had made that position clear to Miss Caroline Graves on the second evening of Miss Graves's visit, standing at the window of the upstairs sitting room while the sound of Cecily's voice carried faintly up through the floorboards. "She is the reader, nothing more," Lady Philippa had said, adjusting the curtain with 2 fingers, as though even the light required management. "My father-in-law enjoys the diversion. One does not form attachments to diversions." Miss Graves, who was 22 and had been raised to agree with women like Lady Philippa, had nodded and said nothing, though her eyes had moved briefly toward the door, as if she were listening too. Cecily Lennox was the daughter of a clergyman who had died owing more than he had ever earned. The parish of St. Clement's in the village of Dunmore had provided her father with a living, a house, and the steady conviction that books were a form of grace sufficient to offset the absence of savings. When he died, the living reverted to the diocese, the house reverted to the church, and Cecily reverted to the charity of a distant cousin who had written 3 letters on her behalf before securing her a position at Hartwell Park. The position paid £12 per annum. It came with a room on the 3rd floor, meals taken with the housekeeper, and the understanding that she was not a guest. She was a function. The household understood this. The Earl did not. He called her Miss Lennox. He asked after her health. He kept a second chair beside his own and would not let anyone remove it. And when she arrived each afternoon at 2 o'clock with the book they had been working through, he would lift one thin hand from the arm of his chair and say, "Ah, there you are." It was the only sentence anyone in Hartwell Park said to her with unguarded warmth, and she had learned to carry it through the rest of the day, like a stone held smooth in the pocket. The book was a volume of verse, old and heavy, with the Earl's own handwriting in the margins. He had annotated it across 40 years, small notes in fading ink that argued with the poet, agreed with him, questioned his reasoning, praised a particular image, and once, beside a stanza about loss, had written only the name Eleanor. Cecily had asked about Eleanor once. The Earl had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said, "My wife. She would have liked you." He had not said anything else, and Cecily had turned the page and continued reading, and the name had stayed in the room like the scent of a flower pressed between pages long ago. Julian Ashworth, Marquis of Ashworth by courtesy and heir to the earldom, had returned to Hartwell Park 11 months ago after 3 years abroad. The household had expected a different man. The Julian who had left England at 27 had been steady, direct, occasionally warm. The Julian who returned at 30 was none of those things. He spoke in short sentences that ended conversations rather than sustaining them. He walked the grounds alone in the early morning. He ate little at dinner and excused himself before the port. And he had a daughter, a small girl of 3 named Rose, who lived in the nursery with a nurse, and who reached for her father's hand when he passed, and found it, more often than not, already withdrawn. Cecily had watched this happen twice from the far end of the gallery. She had said nothing. It was not her place. Nothing at Hartwell Park was her place. And she had made a careful practice of remembering this. The first afternoon Julian appeared in the doorway. Cecily had been reading a passage about autumn, and the Earl had been awake and attentive, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair in time with the meter. She had not heard Julian arrive. She had felt it. A shift in the air pressure at the edge of the room, a quality of attention that was different from the Earl's gentle receptivity. Harder, more deliberate. She had glanced toward the door and seen him standing there with his face still and his eyes on the book in her hands, not on her. And she had looked away so quickly that her voice had stumbled over the next line. The Earl had not noticed. Julian had. She was certain of this because his weight had shifted against the doorframe, a single small adjustment, and then he had been still again. After that, he came every afternoon. He never entered the room. He never sat down. He never spoke. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and he listened to Cecily read to the old Earl. And the old Earl, whose eyes were failing and whose hearing was not what it had been, did not know his grandson was there. The household noticed. Servants notice everything. And they noticed the Marquis's boots in the corridor outside the library at 2:10 every afternoon. And they noticed that the boots did not move until Cecily closed the book at 3:30. And they noticed that when Cecily passed him in the hallway afterward, carrying the book back to the shelf, he did not speak to her, and she did not look at him, and the distance between them was precisely the width of 2 people who were aware of each other in a way neither could afford to name. Mrs. Arden, the housekeeper, who had served the family for 31 years and who had watched Julian grow from a solemn boy into a solemn man, said nothing about it to anyone. She simply began leaving a second lamp lit in the corridor outside the library, and she began setting a tray of tea for 2 on the side table inside the door, though only 1 cup was ever used, because Julian never crossed the threshold, and Cecily would not have presumed to pour for a man whose rank placed him so far above her own that even the act of offering sugar would have been an impertinence. On the 7th afternoon, the Earl said something that stopped Cecily's breath. He had been listening to a passage about winter, and when she paused to turn the page, he reached out and placed his thin hand over hers on the book. "You read the way Eleanor used to talk," he said. Slowly, as though the words were worth the time they took. His hand was warm and light, the bones visible beneath the skin, and Cecily covered it with her own and held it, and she did not look toward the doorway, though she knew Julian was there, because if she looked at him in that moment, she was afraid of what her face would tell him. On the 12th afternoon of this arrangement, something changed. Cecily had been reading for 20 minutes when a small sound came from the corridor behind Julian. Rose had found her way out of the nursery. She stood in the hallway, in a white dress, with her shoes on the wrong feet, holding a wooden horse by one leg, and she was looking up at her father, with the grave, uncertain expression of a child who has learned that proximity is not the same as welcome. Julian looked down at her. His jaw tightened. He did not move. Rose took a step forward and pressed herself against his leg, and Cecily, who had turned at the sound, saw the whole of it. She saw Julian's hand lift and hover over his daughter's head, and then fall back to his side. She saw Rose's fingers close around the fabric of his coat. She saw the cost. Cecily set the book down quietly, marking the page with the Earl's own ribbon, and crossed the room to the doorway. She knelt beside Rose and held out her hand. "Would you like to come in and listen? Your great-grandfather is hearing a very good story." Rose looked at her father. Julian's face did not change. His voice, when it came, was low and level. "Go in, Rose." It was a command. Cecily heard the protection inside it. Rose did not. Rose heard only permission, and she put her small hand in Cecily's and allowed herself to be led to the chair beside the Earl, where Cecily lifted her onto her lap and opened the book so Rose could see the pages. The Earl opened one eye. "Who is this?" he said. "Your great-granddaughter," Cecily said. "She has come to hear the verse." The Earl smiled. It was the first time Cecily had seen him smile in a week, and the sight of it hurt in a way she could not have explained to anyone. She began reading again. Rose settled against her chest. And Julian, standing in the doorway with one hand gripping the frame so hard his knuckles had gone white, watched a woman he had not invited into his life hold his daughter in a way he could not. He did not know she had seen his hand lift and fall. He did not know she understood what it meant. What he knew was simpler and more dangerous. He knew that the small portrait of Margaret, his dead wife, which he carried in the breast pocket of his coat, and which he touched 17 times a day, the way another man might touch a wound to confirm it was still open, had not been touched once in the last 20 minutes. He knew because his hand had reached for it when Rose appeared, and then Cecily had knelt, and his hand had stopped. Miss Graves arrived the following week with 2 trunks, a lady's maid, and the composed assurance of a woman who had been told she was the correct choice. She was not unkind. She was polished and direct, and she wore her gowns with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to let a seam out or wonder whether the fabric would last another season. She took tea with Lady Philippa every morning. She walked the grounds with Julian in the afternoon, her hand resting lightly on his arm, in the manner of a woman who had practiced the gesture in front of a glass. She did not read to the Earl. She visited him once, on the second day, and sat beside his chair for 11 minutes. And when she left, she told Lady Philippa that the room smelled of old paper and coal dust, and that the Earl had not opened his eyes. She did not visit again. Cecily continued reading every afternoon. Julian continued standing in the doorway. And Miss Graves, who was neither foolish nor unobservant, began to notice that the man whose arm she held on the afternoon walks turned his head toward the library windows every time they passed, and that the set of his jaw changed when Cecily's voice, faint and steady, carried through the glass into the autumn air. It was 3 days later that Lady Philippa made her position public. A small dinner had been arranged to welcome Miss Graves formally into the household social sphere, and the table included the Ashworth family, the vicar, Sir Thomas Holt from the neighboring estate, and his wife, Lady Holt. Cecily was not seated at the table. She had not been invited. She was passing through the hall on her way to the kitchen when Lady Holt, who was kind and observant and had once been a clergyman's daughter herself, called out to her. "Miss Lennox, do come in for a moment. I have been meaning to ask you about the volume you have been reading to the Earl." Lady Philippa's voice cut across the table before Cecily could respond. "You mean the reader, Lady Holt. She is occupied with her duties." The word landed in the dining room like a coin dropped on stone. Cecily's hands found each other behind her back. Her chin lifted by a fraction of an inch, the only sign that the word had struck. And she said, "Of course, my lady." Good evening, Lady Holt. She turned and left. Julian, who was seated at the far end of the table with Miss Graves on his right, set down his glass. He did not look at his mother. He looked at the doorway through which Cecily had just passed, and the quality of his attention, the held stillness of it, the way his fingers had tightened around the stem of the glass, was visible to everyone at the table except the woman who had just been told she did not belong there. The Earl's health had been declining for months, and in the 3rd week of November, it declined beyond recovery. Cecily noticed it first. His hands, which had always tapped the chair arm in time with the verse, went still. His breathing, which had been deep and rhythmic, became shallow and irregular. He stopped opening his eyes when she arrived. He stopped saying, "Ah, there you are." He said other things instead. He said Eleanor once, softly, in the middle of a stanza about winter. And Cecily had kept reading, because she understood that the name was not meant for her. She was simply the voice that carried him close enough to hear it. Julian came to the library every afternoon. He no longer stood in the doorway. He sat in the chair across from Cecily, with Rose on his knee, and he listened. Once, when Cecily paused to turn a page, he said, "The passage about the river. Read it again." She read it again. His eyes closed. Rose, curled against his chest, put her thumb in her mouth and was quiet. The 4 of them sat in the amber light of the library, with the fire burning low and the book open between them. And Cecily felt, for a moment so brief she would later wonder if she had imagined it, that this was a room she belonged in. She corrected herself immediately. She corrected herself because she had spent 23 years learning that rooms like this were not meant for women whose shoes were wearing at the heel and whose best dress had been let out twice. She corrected herself because the alternative was a hope she could not afford, and hope was the most expensive thing a poor woman could carry. Julian had not told anyone about Margaret. The household knew the facts. Margaret Ashworth, born Margaret Selwyn, had died 3 years ago in the winter, in childbed, while Julian was in London settling a matter of business that could have waited. He had received the letter at his club. He had ridden through the night. He had arrived at dawn and found the house already draped in black, and his daughter, red-faced and furious and alive, in the arms of a wet nurse whose name he could not remember. He had held Margaret's hand, which was cold and arranged on the counterpane as though she were merely resting, and he had understood that the matter of business that could have waited had cost him everything that could not. The portrait he carried was painted the year they were married. She was smiling in it. He did not look at it. He carried it the way a penitent carries a stone. Cecily learned this not because he told her, which he did not, and not because anyone else told her, which they would not have thought to do, but because on one of the afternoons when the Earl was sleeping and the library was quiet and Julian was sitting in the chair across from her with his eyes on the fire, she saw his hand move to his breast pocket and press flat against the fabric. And then she saw his face, and the face told her everything the hand could not. "You lost someone," she said. She did not ask it. She said it. Julian looked at her. The silence lasted 4 full seconds, which in that room, in that light, with the Earl breathing softly between them, was a very long time. "Yes," he said. "And you believe it was your fault," Cecily said. His jaw moved. The muscle in it tightened and released. "It was," he said. "No," Cecily said. "It was not." She said it the way she read the verse, steady and low and without ornament, and Julian looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face, which was the expression of a man who has just heard someone say the thing he needed to hear and did not know how to receive it. He stood. He crossed the room to the window. He stood there for a long time with his back to her. When he turned, His face was composed again, and his voice, when it came, was level and quiet. "Come inside, Miss Lennox. The corridor will be cold tonight." She was not in the corridor. She was in the library, sitting 3 feet from the fire. She understood that the command was not about temperature. She understood it the way she understood the hand that lifted over Rose's head and fell back to his side. She said, "I am inside, my lord." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "you are." He left the room, and his footsteps were steady in the corridor, and Cecily sat in the chair beside the sleeping Earl and pressed her hands flat against the open book and felt her pulse in her fingertips and did not, for once, correct herself. In the days that followed, the library became a country with its own laws. Julian sat in the chair across from Cecily and listened while she read, and Rose sat on the rug between them with her wooden horse, and the Earl drifted in and out of sleep with his hand on the arm of his chair, and the 4 of them occupied a silence that was not empty. It was full. It was full of the book's voice and the fire's warmth and the particular quality of light that comes through old glass in late autumn when the world outside is preparing to go dark and the world inside is holding on. Julian brought Rose her supper in the library one evening. He set the tray on the low table and said, "Eat, Rose." And then he looked at Cecily and said, "You as well. Sit. You have been standing for 3 hours." She had not been standing. She had been sitting in the chair. She understood that the command was not about standing or sitting. It was about staying. She ate. Rose ate. Julian watched them, and his face, which had been stone for 11 months, showed something at the corners of his mouth that was not yet a smile, and was no longer its absence. Lady Philippa observed this from the gallery landing, where she had paused on her way to the drawing-room. She observed it the way a general observes the movement of troops on a field she had assumed was already secured. She said nothing that evening. She said a great deal the following morning. To Miss Graves in the breakfast room, where the silver gleamed and the rolls were warm, and the conversation was conducted with the precise, surgical efficiency of a woman whose arrangements were being threatened by someone who earned £12 per annum. The Earl of Hartwell died on a Tuesday, in the early morning, with the book of verse open on the table beside his chair, and the fire burned to ash. Cecily found him. She had come early, before the household was awake, because she had known. She had known from the way he had failed to lift his hand the previous afternoon, from the way his breathing had changed, from the way he had said Eleanor, not once, but 3 times, each time more quietly, as though the name were a door he was walking through. She sat beside him for a long time. The room was cold. The windows were gray with the first light, and the park beyond them was still. And the silence in the library was different from the silence of an afternoon when the Earl was sleeping. It was the silence of a room that had lost the person who gave it reason. She closed the book and placed it in his hands, and then she removed it and held it against her chest, because the book was not his anymore, and it was not hers either, and she did not know where it belonged now that the man who had written in its margins was gone. She looked at the name Eleanor on the page that was still open, and she thought that perhaps he had found her, and the thought was not a comfort so much as a recognition that some kinds of love do not require the living to sustain them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Arden, found her there an hour later and put a hand on her shoulder and said nothing, which was the correct thing. And then the house began its machinery of mourning. And inside that machinery, Cecily Lennox was a part that no longer had a function. Lady Philippa moved quickly, By Wednesday afternoon, Cecily had been informed that her position was dissolved, her wages paid through the end of the month, and her room required by Friday. The letter was delivered by a footman who could not meet her eyes. Cecily read it standing in the corridor outside the library, and her hands did not shake, because she had known this, too. She had known it the way she knew the Earl's breathing, the way she knew Julian's hand. She had known it because she had spent her entire life inside rooms that could be taken from her, and the knowledge of impermanence was not a lesson she needed to learn twice. She packed her trunk. She owned very little. The trunk was small, and the packing was quick, and when it was done, she stood in the center of the third-floor room and looked at the narrow bed and the single window, and the view of the park she had watched change through 14 months of seasons. And she permitted herself 30 seconds of grief, which was all she could afford. And then she went downstairs to return the book. The library was empty. The Earl's chair was draped in white cloth. The fire was unlit. The room smelled of dust and absence, and the particular quality of silence that fills a space when the person who gave it meaning is gone. Cecily placed the book on the table beside the covered chair, and she stood there with her hand on its cover, and she said, "Thank you." She said it to the book and to the Earl and to the room and to the 14 months she had been allowed to sit in a chair beside a man who had called her by her name. She ran her thumb along the cracked spine, feeling the leather give beneath her touch the way it had given every afternoon for more than a year, shaped by his hands and then by hers, until the two impressions had become indistinguishable. Then she heard a sound from the corner of the room. Rose was sitting on the floor behind the Earl's desk, holding the wooden horse by one leg, her face blotched and red. She had been crying for a long time, the quiet, determined crying of a child who has learned that no one is coming. She was 3 years old, and she did not understand where her great-grandfather had gone, and no one had come to explain it to her, and the horse in her hand was the only thing in the room that had not changed. Cecily crossed the room and knelt beside her, and gathered her up without a word, and Rose pressed her face into Cecily's neck and held on, and Cecily held on, and the book sat on the table with the Earl's handwriting in its margins, and the light came through the window the way it always had, indifferent to who was there to receive it. On Thursday evening, Lady Philippa held a gathering. It was ostensibly a reception for the neighbors who had come to pay respects, though its true function, which the household understood, and which Cecily understood, and which Miss Graves understood with the quiet competence of a woman who had been prepared for exactly this role, was to present Miss Graves at Julian's side in the drawing-room where the Earl had once held court. The same room where Cecily had first been called the reader. The same room where Lady Holt had spoken her name and been corrected. The guests arrived in the late afternoon. Cecily, whose trunk was packed and whose departure was arranged for the morning coach, had not been invited. She was in the kitchen passage collecting the last of her things when she heard a voice she recognized. Sir Thomas Holt's wife was speaking to another guest in the corridor, and the words carried clearly through the plaster. "The reader, I am told, has ideas above her station. Lady Philippa says the girl imagined herself a fixture. Can you credit it?" The other guest murmured something indistinct, and Lady Holt said, "A fixture," as though 14 months of reading to a dying man were nothing more than ambition. The word landed differently this time. It landed on stone that had already been struck twice, and Cecily, standing in the kitchen passage with her coat over her arm, felt the fracture run through the center of her composure for the first time since she had arrived at Hartwell Park. She set her coat on the hook. She pressed her palms flat against the wall. She breathed. She did not leave by the kitchen door. She could have. The coach was not until morning, and she could have spent the night in the housekeeper's room, and no one would have looked for her. And by Friday she would have been gone, and the household would have closed around the space she left, the way water closes around a stone. She did not leave because Rose was in the nursery, and Rose had not stopped crying since Tuesday, and the nurse had reported that the child would not eat, and would not sleep, and would not release the wooden horse, and Cecily had promised nothing to anyone, least of all to a 3-year-old girl whose father could not hold her. And yet she climbed the stairs to the nursery and sat beside Rose's cot and sang to her until the child's breathing steadied and her grip on the horse loosened and her eyes closed. It was this that Julian saw when he came looking for his daughter. He stood in the nursery doorway the way he had stood in the library doorway, with one shoulder against the frame, and he watched Cecily smooth the hair from Rose's forehead and draw the blanket over her shoulders and press her lips briefly, very briefly, to the child's temple. She did not know he was there. She had not heard him. She heard him when he spoke. Miss Lennox. His voice was low and rough at the edge in a way she had not heard before. She turned. He was in the doorway, and his face was not composed, and his hand was at his breast pocket, and then it was not. It was at his side. "She is settled," Cecily said. "I will go now." "No," Julian said. He said it the way he said, "Go in, Rose." A command with something moving beneath it, something that was not command at all. "Come downstairs." "I am not invited downstairs, my lord." "You are now." The drawing room was full. Lady Philippa stood near the fireplace with Miss Graves at her side, and Miss Graves wore a dress of pale blue silk that caught the candlelight, and Lady Philippa wore the expression of a woman whose arrangements were proceeding exactly as designed. Sir Thomas Holt and his wife were by the window. The vicar stood near the door. A dozen neighbors filled the chairs and lined the walls, and the room held the particular hush of a gathering that knows it is witnessing something it has not quite identified. Julian entered from the far door with Cecily behind him, and the room's attention shifted the way a field of grass shifts when the wind changes direction. Lady Philippa's chin lifted. Miss Graves's hand found the back of the nearest chair. Cecily stood just inside the doorway with her plain dark dress and her worn shoes and her hands at her sides, and she did not look at anyone, because every face in the room was looking at her. And she had spent 14 months learning that being looked at in this house was not the same as being seen. Julian crossed the room. He did not hurry. His stride was measured, 3 steps, 4, 5, and the room parted for him the way it had always parted, because he was the Marquis of Ashworth and the Earl's heir, and the tallest man in any room he entered, and the parting was automatic and total. He stopped beside Cecily. He turned to face the room. The silence was complete. Every glass was still. Every breath was held. Lady Philippa's lips parted, and for the first time in 14 months, no sound came from them. Julian spoke. "Miss Lennox stays. She stays as my wife." 9 words. The room did not move. Lady Philippa's hand found the mantelpiece, and her fingers gripped it, and the color left her face in a slow tide that started at her temples and moved downward. Miss Graves released the chair. Her expression did not collapse. It rearranged carefully into something that looked like recognition, as though she had understood before this moment what this moment would contain and had already begun the private work of revision. Sir Thomas Holt set down his glass. Lady Holt pressed her hand over her mouth. The vicar, who had baptized Rose and who had read the service over the Earl's body that morning, nodded once, the small definitive nod of a man who has witnessed a procedural act and found it sound. Julian did not look at his mother. He did not look at Miss Graves. He looked at Cecily. She looked back at him. Her hands were shaking. She could not stop them. She did not try. "My lord," she said, and her voice was steady even if her hands were not. He reached down and took her hand. the one that was shaking, and held it. And the shaking stopped. And the room, which had been holding its breath, released it. And the sound of that collective exhalation was the sound of a verdict being overturned in the same chamber where it had first been delivered. Lady Philippa did not speak. She stood at the mantelpiece with her hand still gripping the stone, and her mouth opened and closed twice, and then she turned and left the room by the far door. And her footsteps were quick and uneven in the corridor. And no one followed her, and no one needed to. Because the machinery she had built and maintained for 14 months had been dismantled in 9 words by the one person whose authority exceeded her own. The snow began that night. It came softly, without wind, and it covered the park in a white silence that muffled the house and the grounds and the long drive that led away from Hartwell and toward the road Cecily would not be taking in the morning. She sat in the library. The white cloth had been removed from the Earl's chair. The fire had been built back, high and bright, and the room was warm for the first time in days. Rose was asleep on the settle, wrapped in a blanket, with the wooden horse tucked under her arm. The book of verse was open in Cecily's lap, and the Earl's handwriting was visible in the margins, his small, precise notes arguing with a poet who could no longer argue back. And beside the stanza about loss, the name Eleanor in fading ink, written by a hand that had loved someone well enough to mark her name in the margin of a page about what it costs to be without her. Julian came to the library doorway. He stood there for a moment, one shoulder against the frame, the old habit, the old posture. Cecily looked up. She did not say anything. She waited. He crossed the threshold. He sat down in the chair beside her, the chair the Earl had refused to let anyone remove, and he reached into his breast pocket and took out the small portrait of Margaret and looked at it for a long time. And then he set it on the table beside the book, face up, where the light from the fire touched the painted smile of a woman who had died too young in a house that was only now learning what it meant to let someone in. Cecily turned the page. She began reading aloud, her voice low and steady in the warm room, and Rose stirred on the settle and settled again, and the snow fell against the windows, and Julian listened. He was no longer in the doorway. He was inside the room. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's voice carried you somewhere warm, leave a word about the moment that held you longest.